I'm Joe Fetterman from Colliers Life Sciences. We're here today with Michele Washko. Michele is the CEO of Respana. Michele, welcome to Lab Notes.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's really exciting to have you here today because you've had such a rich career. And I think we can't dive into Respana without talking a little bit about the path that brought you here.
Sure. What I would say is that I bring a 360-degree perspective to the life sciences ecosystem, if you will. I began my career in earnest at Merck and Company in new product launches. And then from there, I worked for a bit more than a decade for an early stage venture fund called the Life Sciences Greenhouse of Central Pennsylvania. And then I worked for Geisinger Health System, which is an integrated delivery system. And if you know much about hospital systems, you know that that means there's an insurer piece as well as an inpatient piece and an outpatient piece. And so it's very interesting to have had an expertise and an opportunity to work in all of those environments. And I think that is what has brought me here today to this role as CEO of Respana Therapeutics.
Michele, when you say a 360-degree perspective, you're not kidding. I mean, you've really the insurance side, the reimbursement side. I mean, you've touched it all over. So let's shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about Respana and how it was that you were segueing from your last position into the role as CEO, which is a relatively new role. And we'd love to hear about that as well, of taking over the reins and what it's like to be a brand new CEO.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is that it's very exciting, and I am really excited about the opportunity and grateful to my colleagues at Respana for giving me this chance to demonstrate that the experiences I've had will really be able to take this company to the next level. Respana is a company that came to my attention while working as a consultant for the Center for Medical Innovation at Hershey, at Penn State Hershey. And what that gave me the opportunity to do was to look at the various types of research, the work being done by many of the researchers there, particularly in the arena related to novel therapeutics development, and to get a firsthand look at what the commercialization opportunities were. And when I saw this one, when I saw the technology coming out of the lab of Dr. Coronius, I was really enthusiastic. I think it has a lot of promise. Briefly, the technology, it's a novel target for addressing ramifications, the complications, the terrible effects that can result from respiratory infections. And because this approach is novel, it targets the patient, something happening in the patient versus something happening in the pathogen. It represents essentially a novel therapeutic opportunity, a novel tool in the arsenal, if you will.
And so it sounds like the novelty was attractive. Were there other things about the company? I mean, you got a chance to look at a lot of different therapeutics coming through, and boy, this one grabbed you. You know, it was kind of like no holds barred. This is it. This is the real deal.
That was really my thinking at the time. And there were a couple of things that made the difference for me. Maybe jump in where I had not done that previously. One was that the researchers, the discoverers, so Dr. Coronius, his lab, and then Neil Christensen is the person who worked with him to develop the antibody. They are just great guys to work with, frankly. Really smart, but also self-effacing and really insightful and able to articulate what is happening in this particular arena with a clarity that got me really excited as someone who doesn't have a PhD in science or a medical degree. I didn't need one once I heard what was the fundamental insight here. So that's pretty exciting. And also there was a new CEO on board at the time, Dr. Tim Pallura, who is working for another Pennsylvania company, Opticura, at the moment. He's a wealth of knowledge, a really well-respected serial entrepreneur. So the opportunity to work with Tim and Zissis and Neil. And then I got to reconnect with another gentleman with whom I'd worked previously, an investment banker by the name of Andy Agrawal. And the opportunity to work with those four guys, and really try and build a company sort of from the ground up was really compelling.
Wow. Well, I can see how it all aligned and why it made sense to do that. You know, we've talked about several things today, and in one of the conversations that we had, we discussed the idea about how important having a reimbursement strategy is for young, growing uh, drug development therapeutics companies. And I'd like to spend a little bit more time on that because, as we discussed earlier, that's not a topic that is given a lot of airtime. We typically talk a lot about financing, venture, private equity, getting your development in a position to be funded, and we talk about the clinical stages. But we don't often talk about the actual reimbursement strategy and where this therapeutic is headed ultimately when it comes to market. Let's how does one figure that out, Michele?
That is a really good question, and you're absolutely right when you say that folks don't necessarily give this a lot of thought. I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of researchers, and often they think, the science is great, the technology is great, it's going to be smooth sailing from here, and that's definitely not the case. There's a lot of hard work, and not least of which goes into the reimbursement strategy. And what folks might not understand is that in addition to getting the clearances through from the Food and Drug Administration, you also needed to be thinking about what's going to drive adoption, who is going to pay for this, under what conditions, how does this fit into the existing therapeutic arsenal, if you will, and how is it going to be compelling enough for payers to really to include that into their portfolio. There's a particular kind of expertise that goes with understanding that, and there are actually some firms that tend to fly under the radar that have particular expertise in this arena. And one of the things I'll advise anyone with an emerging company, a startup company, is to have those conversations early, seek those people out and have those conversations early, because without the appropriate reimbursement strategy, it's going to be really hard to attract payers and to drive adoption.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I was going to ask when in the development stage should that happen. So early is really good. And so let's speak to that. Have you seen companies that have gotten information that's actually changed somewhat the course of their trajectory?
I certainly have seen that, yes. One of the things that's really important is understanding the role of the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. I think many of the folks in our space, in the life science space, will understand the huge role they play in determining what gets approved, not what gets approved so much, but what gets paid for and what gets adopted. So there's a particular strategy that's required to approach CMS and to understand what their needs are and what their concerns might be, and then to articulate the thinking of the actions of CMS with the broader payer environment. Here in the US, we have a relatively fractured payer environment. This is not true globally, but because many of us developing a novel therapeutic want to launch first in the US, it's really important to iron that out as quickly as possible. It feeds to your clinical trial strategy. So when you're developing a novel therapeutic, you want to look at who is the appropriate patient population, but the studies you conduct and the endpoints in those studies will also have bearing ultimately on what is reimbursable and to what extent. So you really can't start thinking about that too early.
Well, that's a good segue to turn back to Respana. So let's talk about what's ahead in your future as it relates to all of these things: reimbursement strategy, the clinical next steps, and fundraising. Where are things, and what are you looking ahead to?
Sure. So Respana is very much an early stage. We're a preclinical company, so we're still actually just concluding the mouse work, if you will. We have a humanized antibody, and we're studying that in humanized mice, or I should say Dr. Cronius and his colleagues are studying that in humanized mice through a subcontract to Penn State University. And we know that we need to be exploring the various clinical pathways. And to that end, we've recently formed our scientific advisory board. We have a clinician from the University of Alabama, and we have a professor emeritus from Harvard University with some business expertise and also clinical expertise. We had our first scientific advisory board meeting just this week, which was really an exciting step for us. And they're helping us map out the pathway. What we think we'll do first is go into the treatment of complications of influenza. And for us, a likely clinical pathway would be to try and test this out in hospitalized patients who are at high risk, meaning those over 55 or immunocompromised. But that's just really one approach. And one of the things that I see as my role as CEO is to really explore that further and understand the full range of possibilities, because we could also work, for example, in novel coronaviruses. And certainly I don't have to tell anyone here what a novel coronavirus could potentially do. So we have opportunities there, potentially in fibrotic respiratory diseases as well. So given there are so many options with a target like this, we really need to be super clear on what that clinical strategy is going to look like. And that's a lot of what I'll be doing here over the next 3 to 6 months, is ensuring that I have as much information to make the best decision possible along with my colleagues.
Michele, all I can say is Respana is really lucky to have you stepping into that. Your energy and experience is fantastic. This has been a wonderful conversation. I know we're going to want to check back with you soon to see how things are progressing. Thank you very much for joining us and spending time with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.